Being autistic and/or ADHD and having a parent or two parents who show signs of narcissistic personality disorder is more common than you'd believe. Hi, I'm Essie. I'm an autistic and ADHD therapist. Today, I'm talking about why narcissistic behaviors may show up in parents of neurodivergent folks. In my practice, I see countless neurodivergent clients who report to me that their parents seem very self-absorbed, they use their children for their own entertainment or gratification, they treat them as a source of narcissistic supply. Narcissistic parents use guilt, shame, and manipulation to keep their children under control, to disrespect their boundaries, and to keep them in an enmeshed family dynamic while parentifying them into the role of the adult in the relationship, being the custodian of their feelings. Neurodivergent children who are subjected to this behavior often have to suppress their authentic selves because being neurodivergent might not be seen as an attractive or acceptable trait to their narcissistic parents. And this has pretty serious knock-on effects for the neurodivergent's life. That person will grow up being most likely a people pleaser who engages in codependent behaviors and doesn't understand healthy boundaries. They may go through life with a deeply entrenched sense of shame that they're not good enough, that they're a bad person, that they've done something really wrong, and that for the rest of their lives, they need to bow and scrape and self-flagellate to make up for this deficit. Granted, neurodivergent children are already subjected to similar behavior growing up in an ableist society. They're told they're too sensitive, they're too noisy, they're too energetic, they're too difficult, they're too dumb, and they already have a sense of inferiority as a result of this. Coupled together with having a narcissistic parent, that child is more likely to grow up with pretty substantial mental health challenges as a result. So why might neurodivergent people have narcissistic parents to begin with? Well, we know that personality disorders often develop as a result of somebody having an insecure attachment style. Basically, how your parents raise you, if they're attentive to your needs, if they show up, if they hold and comfort you during your times of distress, if they're responsive to your needs, can impact your ability to form healthy attachments to them and to other people in your life. If a parent doesn't show up for you in these ways, you're more likely to develop an insecure attachment style, like anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. Insecure attachment appears in higher rates among neurodivergent populations, and I believe this is because of two reasons. First of all, intergenerational transmission. The way parents conduct themselves with their own attachment style in their relationship with their child, this can be then transferred to the child in the form of an insecure attachment. And when that child grows up, if they don't repair that insecure attachment, they can repeat the same patterns with their own children. The second factor is minority stress. Growing up in an ableist society, neurodivergents are targeted, persecuted, excluded, ostracized, you name it. The pressures of trying to survive in this society leads to a unique form of stress that can have serious implications for their physical and mental well-being. While our attachment styles can be shaped by our relationships with our primary caregivers, there are other people in our life who can also contribute to that attachment style. Friends, peers, siblings, extended family members, pets, therapists, these are all forms of secondary attachment figures who impact our ability to form healthy attachments. Living in an ableist society, we're more likely to be subjected to behavior by these secondary attachment figures that leads to us developing an insecure attachment. For example, in school, being rejected and bullied by our peers. Having a teacher who becomes angry at us for behaving in ways that aren't conventional as a result of our unique neurotype. Neurodivergent children thus experience a double layer of invalidation, which puts them at greater risk of developing insecure attachment styles. Children with insecure attachment styles are, statistically speaking, more likely to go on and develop personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder. Why is this the case? Personality disorders represent a rigid adherence to a set of ego defenses, behaviors we use to defend our ego against anxiety or threatening experiences. If your needs haven't been attended to, if you've been ignored, shunned, bullied, or treated in the many myriad horrible ways that neurodivergents are often treated in ableist societies, you're more likely, therefore, to resort to using these defenses because you have nothing else to protect you against the onslaught of rejection. Narcissism in itself can be seen as an ego defense, inflating one's self-worth to compensate for feelings of inferiority, but it's often accompanied by other ego defenses like denial, where you deny what's blatantly obvious because it's inconvenient or it's threatening, or projection, where you project your own undesirable qualities onto another person. In this sense, narcissism can be seen as a normative response to an unhealthy situation. And remember where I said personality disorders involve rigidly adhering to those ego defenses? Well, that's where it becomes a problem, because all of us use ego defenses in some measure in certain situations, and when we refuse to consider alternative behaviors that might be more productive, that's when we get into trouble. One of the hallmarks of ableism is that society fails to recognize, acknowledge, and adequately support neurodivergent people and their needs. It makes sense, therefore, that some individuals may resort to being grandiose, to being selfish, to being manipulative, to being controlling in order to get their needs met. If everybody in your life, from your parents to your peers, to your colleagues, to your partners, don't accept you for who you are and don't provide understanding, empathy, compassion, and support when you struggle, it's more likely that you'll start seeing people as levers to be pulled in service of your needs. Narcissists are known for experiencing what has been termed fragile entitlement. The fragility makes sense, especially if they're neurodivergent and they've been shamed for who they are from an early age. The entitlement is a response to their needs not being met, as in they go into the world and feel entitled to have those needs met without any sense of obligation to the other person or to society as a whole. Narcissism isn't great because it's a form of self-sabotage. The behaviors that you employ as a result of these ego defenses isn't likely to endear you to other people, and it's likely to cause substantial damage to those in your orbit. Refusing to have empathy for others because at some point or throughout your life, others have failed to have empathy for you is not a great approach because these behaviors can often drive people away. They become so exhausted, so frustrated, so hurt by the behavior of the narcissist that they decide the only viable option is to reject and shun them. So the neurodivergent narcissist's shame is activated and their fear of rejection comes true. And here's the challenge. With personality disorders, there's often a lack of insight about the behaviors and how they bring about certain consequences. Someone who is narcissistic will continually employ the same behaviors, no matter the consequences, oblivious to the impact it has and how it's a form of self-sabotage. Most, if not all, sincere attempts by other people around them to reach out and to support them, to understand them, to care for them, to help them overcome the shame and the fear of rejection is not well received, and it isn't taken on board. The narcissist, more likely than not, will continue to rigidly employ the same behaviors as part of their ego defenses, come hell or high water. To bring this back to the topic of parental narcissism, imagine being a child who's growing up in a household with a parent who is narcissistic, while you are struggling with your own unique neurotype and the challenges of living in an ableist society. Narcissistic parents demand that the child acts as an extension of their will, like an extra limb, treating them as if their only purpose in life is to fulfill their needs. At the same time, the narcissistic parent will punish those who fail to toe the line. They end up rejecting and punishing their children in the same way that they were likely rejected and punished. Their behaviors effectively transfer the shame they refuse to feel into their children. Their children will go out into the world carrying this shame, not feeling resilient at all because they don't have support at home, and the shame will continue to grow because they're subjected to the travails of ableism. Their peers may tease and mock and bully them for their unique behaviors, and teachers may criticize them for failing to pay attention, and these behaviors will add up. The neurodivergent child feels like they have no recourse. There is nowhere for them to go where they can feel safe. They can't go to their parents for comfort. They can't go to their peers for comfort. Now, the neurodivergent child has a couple of options. They themselves can resort to behaving in narcissistic ways to compensate for these feelings of shame, or they can use alternate strategies. They, for example, might become empaths, always attuning themselves to the needs of others. They may engage in people-pleasing behaviors to avoid being rejected and to get people on their side, and so they can be socially accepted. They may resort to masking their neurodivergent traits, camouflaging them, or compensating for them so they can win social acceptance. In both cases, the neurodivergent child is presenting what is termed a false self. With narcissism, they're presenting an overinflated, idealized version of themselves to others because they believe that will win acceptance and approval. The neurodivergent who takes the second option is presenting a socially acceptable self, which isn't overinflated, but isn't authentic either. With a little bit of pressure, that false self can collapse. In the case of the narcissist, their fragile entitlement can be triggered by a perceived slight. As a result, they're more likely to fly into narcissistic rage or engage in retaliation. For the neurodivergent who resorts to masking, camouflaging, and compensating, they're more likely to experience burnout from the fatigue of continually presenting this false front. They will also develop an imposter syndrome, believing that their true self is inadequate. And the more they employ these behaviors, the more distant they become from this authentic self, to the point where they don't even know who they are anymore. The legacy of becoming an empath as a neurodivergent growing up in a household with narcissistic parents is that you continue to engage in this people-pleasing, in this self-sacrifice, in this masking, in an attempt to win approval, which always seems fleeting. This puts the neurodivergent at greater expense of being exploited by other narcissists or by people with bad intentions. They may experience heightened levels of anxiety and depression from the continual stress and low self-worth that they experience as a result of this attachment trauma. The neurodivergent empath may continue their relationship with their narcissistic parents, who will continue to use them as a source of narcissistic supply by either bullying, controlling, smearing, pulling them down in some way to gratify themselves. They may replicate the same behavior with other people because that's all they know and continually fall into relationships with people who mistreat them. They may wonder, am I a bad person? What's wrong with me? Why does this keep happening? Oblivious to the fact that they are carrying pretty substantial damage as a result of this upbringing. Healing for neurodivergent empaths begins when we start to recognize these patterns, when we start to get back in touch with our authentic selves, and we start to set boundaries around behaviors that are ultimately harmful for us. We have to decide to break from the pattern of people-pleasing and serving other people's needs so we can achieve self-realization, to come into our own, to be authentic, and to not always put up this false front because we fear shame and rejection. It's a difficult path to walk, but it's one that you shouldn't walk alone. And this is why therapy can be so helpful. If you can find a neuro-informed and neuro-affirming therapist who understands dynamics of narcissism and enmeshed families, you can shed this role that you've adopted as a matter of survival and become your own person. A recurring theme in a lot of my clinical work with neurodivergence is this legacy that they've been left with as a result of narcissistic parenting. Processing that, understanding that they weren't responsible for what their parents did to them, that they aren't responsible as well for appeasing their parents or fulfilling their needs, is a huge leap, but it is one that's necessary to start the transformation process. A lot of neurodivergent empaths may struggle to make this connection because they don't want to attack their parents. In a sense, they've colluded with their parents in idealizing them and believing them to be perfect or ideal parents, or they bought into the sad backstory that their narcissistic parents have sold them. And this sad backstory often involves them having suffered to some extent, which they see as a justification for their behaviors towards their children. The biggest struggle for the neurodivergent empath is to make this separation between themselves and the narcissistic parent, to have a healthy boundary in which they don't feel beholden to the needs, the wants, and the projections of their parent. Being a neurodivergent empath is a strength, but it is one that can be exploited by people who aren't willing to do the work that's necessary for personal growth and development. The question as to whether one should continue a relationship with a narcissistic parent, especially after all the harm they've inflicted, is one for each individual to consider. If anything I've discussed today resonates with you, please sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had experience with narcissism in your life, if you identify as a neurodivergent empath, and how this dynamic has played out for you in your own life. If you found this video helpful, I would love it if you liked it, you subscribed to my channel, and you shared it with anyone you think might benefit from my content. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.